So this evening, we're going to start off by taking roll. I'm just kidding. Yeah, just so Pastor Danny knows. Yeah. So this evening is going to be more of like a classroom style. And it's going to be about apologetics. So we're going to be covering the apparent war and contradiction between Christianity and science. So I will be asking you questions throughout, and you can feel free to raise your hand and answer, and speak loudly so that everyone can hear you. And so it's going to be interactive, and I'm asking you to put your thinking hats on for tonight. So I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine, oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to need that. I forget it every time. Imagine you are at some sort of work function, and you mention to one of your coworkers that you are a Christian. And he says this to you. So this is your coworker speaking to you. I don't think religion gives us anything useful. Science is the only area where we can have true knowledge. If you can quantify something or test it in a lab, then you can know it. Otherwise, it's just one person's opinion against another's. To me, the sole value of religion is that believing it helps some people who need that sort of thing. But religious beliefs are neither true nor rational because they are not scientifically based. So how would you respond, if anyone wants to throw out? How would you respond to that?
Did ChatGPT tell you that?
Yeah, that's really good. Yes?
Did you test that claim in the lab? That knowledge?
So they've just made a knowledge claim, right? And was it tested in a lab? Did science prove that it's true? Right, yeah, and we're going to go there and talk through that. Have any of you run into this sort of thing? You have? Yes. In college? Oh yeah, for sure. Any of you students getting ready to go to college for sure are going to run into this. This is the prevailing philosophy, I think, of probably most of the university. So this statement is based on a belief that is called scientism. Scientism, which is different from science, and I'll explain that. And here's a definition of scientism. Scientism is the view that science is the only paradigm of truth and rationality. Science is the only way that you can truly know anything. So if your coworker is right, then there are a number of implications. Number one, if something is not proven scientifically, it cannot be true or rational. That's the first implication. Number two, if something does not square with currently well-established scientific beliefs, it cannot be true or rational. And number three, everything outside of science is a matter of mere belief and subjective opinion. So, if scientism is true, there are things that you can be certain about and things that you can't be certain about. Things you can be certain about are things like the distance from the Earth to the Sun, 93 million miles. The chemical makeup of water, H2O. What a magnetic field is like and how it relates to electricity. So those are things you can be certain about. Things that you cannot be certain about are moral judgments, morality. You can't know whether abortion is right or wrong. Science can't answer moral questions. Politics, political questions. You can't know what the state ought to do with health care. Science can't answer political questions. Religion, you can't know that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, or whether Allah is God instead of the God of the Bible. Science can't answer religious questions. So you can't know these things. In philosophy, science can't answer philosophical questions because it's outside of the realm of science. So if scientism is true, and this is a question for you guys, what would be the implications for Christianity? If scientism is true, what would be the implications for Christianity?
That truth is relevant.
Truth is relative?
You have to be relevant.
Yeah. If scientism is true, then theology is not a rational enterprise. Theology is not a rational enterprise. There's no such thing as theological knowledge if scientism is true. And this, the third one, is important. The conversation between science and theology is a one-way conversation. Theology listens to science and waits for science to give its support. Theology has nothing to say to science. Theology must remain mute. If science says that people don't raise from the dead, then we have to change our theology to match that. So science can lend credence to certain theological beliefs, but theology cannot lend credence to scientific research. It doesn't go that direction. Science is king. All other disciplines, including theology, must bow to science, if scientism is true. So I'm going to explain why it's not true, and I hope you're glad about that. So there are a number of problems with scientism. Number one, it is self-refuting, and as a result, it is necessarily false. And I'll explain that. So what does it mean to say that something is self-refuting?
Contradictory.
What's that?
Contradictory.
It's contradictory. Yeah, how is it contradictory? If something is self-refuting, it's a particular...
Scientism can't be proved in experiments. It's like what Jessica was saying.
Right, yeah. So a self-defeating or a self-refuting statement is one that fails to meet its own standard of rationality. Does that make sense? Let me say it again. A self-refuting statement is one that fails to meet its own standard of rationality. In other words, it's a statement that cannot live up to its own criteria. It's a statement that cannot live up to its own criteria. You've seen, yeah, Brandon.
I think one of the things that I've seen on different various videos and stuff, Cycling and others have challenged them. Somebody said there's no such thing as absolute truth. You know, say, is that absolutely true? Yes. Right. It's a self-refuting idea.
Yeah, if it's true, then it's false. If it's false, then it's false. There's no world in which it can be true. So here's a more technical definition. A statement is self-refuting if it lays down a condition that must be met by any good or worthwhile belief and does not itself satisfy that condition. So these kinds of statements are necessarily false. And this is a very important concept to understand because most attacks against Christianity, especially from the philosophical side, are self-refuting at their core. They cannot stand on their own. So please let me know if you don't understand as I'm going through this. It's important that you understand it. So here's a fairly mundane example of a self-refuting sentence. Okay, all statements are false. Does that make sense? All statements are false. So is that a statement? Then it's false, correct? So here are some other examples. I cannot speak any English sentences. You see why that's self-refuting? Nothing can be truly known. Why is that one self-refuting?
I know.
How do I know? Do I truly know that? Here's another one. Question authority. Why is that one self-refuting? Question authority.
You're taking from a position of authority.
Yeah. Stop telling me what to do. Right? You quit telling me to stop questioning authority. Right? Quit telling me to question authority. I believe in the rejection of all creeds. What's that? Yes. It is wrong to push your morals on someone else. Why is that self-refuting?
Because that implies a standard of morality within it that you're pushing upon others.
Exactly.
Have no rules.
Yeah. There is no absolute truth. We talked about that one. There is no. Is that absolutely true? No one can know any truth about religion. Why is that one self-refuting? That's a pretty radical statement that you're making about religion when you say nobody can know anything about religion. You're making a religious statement. Talking about God is meaningless. You see why that one is self-refuting? You should doubt everything. Right? You should doubt everything. You should be tolerant of all views. You see why that one is self-refuting? It's arrogant to claim to have the truth. See, these are all real world examples. Let's look at two statements that express scientism again, and let's apply the standard of self-refutation to these. So number one, science is the only way that we can know anything with certainty. Why is this self-refuting? Science is the only way that we can know anything with certainty. Why is that self-refuting?
What's the best statement by science?
The question you have is, do you know that with certainty? It appears you do, because you're saying it to me. It appears you believe that you know that statement with certainty. If you don't say it with certainty, and if it's just your opinion, then I need to get to the side dishes here. And if that's just your opinion, then why are you even saying it to me? You obviously believe it with certainty, yes.
How can you prove that statement with science?
Yeah, how can you prove that statement with science? Which scientific experiment or observation proved this statement to be true? Like, which lab were you in? Were you at IBM? Where were you? If science is the only way to know the truth of anything, which scientific study or observation proved it? What was it? Was it chemistry? Was it physics, geology, zoology, ecology, meteorology? Like, which field proved that statement of science? So here's another statement. If you can't test it in a laboratory, it's nothing but a bunch of nonsense and idle opinion. If you can't test it in a laboratory, it's nothing but a bunch of nonsense and idle opinion. How would you explain why this is self-refuting? You can't test that statement in a laboratory. So by definition, it is a bunch of nonsense and idle opinion. The statement itself is a bunch of nonsense and idle opinion. So what I'm trying to show you is that scientism is necessarily false. If it is true, if the statements of scientism are true, then the person is sawing off the branch that they're sitting on. And it is necessarily false. So scientism is a philosophical statement about science. It is not science itself. It's not the same type of statement as saying that the Earth is 93 million miles away from the sun. I'm going to use a philosophical word and I'll define it. It's an epistemological statement about how we can know things. It's not a scientific statement. So epistemology is a branch of philosophy concerned with how we can know things. So it's the study of true beliefs, how you can know things with certainty. So epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from mere opinion. So scientism is actually not science, it's epistemology. Statements of scientism are non-scientific utterances that state that you can't trust any non-scientific utterances. Does that make sense? Scientism is a philosophical statement that says that you can't be certain about any philosophical statements. So like I said, scientism saws off the branch it sits on. When something is necessarily false, there is no possible world in which it could be true. And here's another problem with scientism, is that it's unlivable. All of us hold perfectly true and rational beliefs that are not available to the scientific method to prove. Here are some examples. We all believe in logical and mathematical truths. And they cannot be proven by science. Science presupposes logic and math. To try to prove them by science would be arguing in a circle. So science depends on the foundation of mathematics and logic. Metaphysical truths, such as that there are other minds other than my own, or that the external world is real, or that the past wasn't created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. These are all metaphysical truths that we are all perfectly justified in believing and holding to be true, even though science cannot prove any of them. Ethical beliefs about statements of value are not accessible to the scientific method. You can't show by science whether the Nazi scientists did anything in the camps to the children that is more or less evil than the doctors, our current doctors in children's hospitals. Although current doctors in children's hospitals are starting to approach the Nazis, I think. You can't prove ethical beliefs through science. Aesthetic judgment cannot be accessed by the scientific method. But we would all agree and be justified in believing that the beautiful, we would all be justified in believing things like an Idaho sunset at the end of the summer is way more beautiful than a cow pie. Right? That is not accessible to the scientific method, but we would all be perfectly justified in believing it to be true. So here's some other real-world examples of rational, non-scientific knowledge. I know that Jackie cannot both be my wife and not be my wife at the same time in the same sense. I know that, but it's not scientific. It's logic. I know it is morally wrong to torture babies for fun. Science doesn't give me that knowledge. I know what I ate for breakfast last Monday. That's not accessible, but it's true. It's a true belief. I know the truth is when a belief, statement, or idea corresponds with reality. That is true as well, though science didn't tell me that. I know that, well, I already said it, a summer sunset in Idaho is more beautiful than a cow pie. All of these are rational beliefs, and none of them are accessible to the scientific method. To deny them would be to resign yourself to an insane asylum. So especially things like logic, we all use logic every day. I walk out into the street and my mind tells me, justifiably so, that it's either me or the bus, right? And if I deny logic at that point, the reality of it's either, of that law of logic, I die. So if you deny logic, you won't last the day. You will die. And yet science hasn't told us any of those things, but we believe them to be true. The third problem with scientism is that if scientism is true, then science itself is impossible. Many scientifically unfounded beliefs are required to carry out the scientific method. And these beliefs cannot be proven by the scientific method. For instance, the existence of a theory-independent external world. The orderly, rational nature of creation, of the external world. You can't prove that with science, and yet science, in order to do science, you must believe that creation is orderly. The knowability of the external world, not accessible to the scientific method. The existence of truth. Obviously, science rests on the idea that there is absolute truth. And science can't prove that there is an absolute truth. The laws of logic, the reliability of our cognitive and sensory faculties to serve as truth gatherers and as a source of justified beliefs in our intellectual environment. This is a big one. The adequacy of language to describe the world. Have you guys all ever read a scientific journal? They believe that language is adequate to describe the external world. Science didn't give them that. The uniformity of nature and the idea that researchers can form general theories from specific observations. The value of deduction and induction in particular. The existence of numbers and mathematical truths. So if scientism is true, and you cannot trust anything that has not been proven by the scientific method, then the scientific enterprise itself is impossible. If you decide that any of these items is not true, oh, and I forgot one. The morality also affects science. They have to believe in the existence of values that are used in science. For example, you must test theories fairly and report test results honestly. If you throw that out the door, and that has been done a lot, if you throw that out the door, moral statements such like that, you must report your test results honestly, there is no science. So if you decide any of these items is not true, science becomes completely unworkable. Science works because these things are true, but science has proven none of them. So proving them requires philosophical and theological reasoning, not scientific reasoning. So in reality, science rests on philosophy and theology. So science is like one step up from the foundations, from true foundations. Many worldviews do not contain within their philosophical premises any room for science. For instance, Theravada Buddhism denies the existence of an enduring self to know the world and an enduring real world to be known. Consequently, you will not find a Theravada Buddhist among the greats of science, and you will find no significant scientific achievements flowing from cultures that are dominated by this worldview. There are many worldviews that contain within their basic philosophical and theological worldview assumptions no room for science. And oddly enough, as our culture continues diving into the scientism worldview, science, we're going to discover that the scientific enterprise is going to start dissipating in our culture. Oddly enough, as they embrace scientism. You don't see science flourish in these cultures that don't have a worldview that supports the scientific enterprise. So, and this is why science flourished in Christian Europe. All of the greats of science were Christians. The Christian worldview assumes and gives credence to all of these beliefs that are required for science. So, there are significant implications for Christian theology if scientism is false. If scientism is false, then, number one, theology is a rational enterprise that searches for true knowledge. And number two, theological observation, and this is an important one for you guys to understand. Theological observations can and should influence how scientific observations are interpreted. Does that make sense? It's no longer a one-way conversation between science and Christianity. It's now a two-way conversation. Honestly, with theology being the king, and science being subservient. So I want you to imagine with me a hobby horse farm with horses of all sizes. From Clydesdales, huge horses, down to miniature horses and ponies and everything in between. Now imagine a large flood sweeping the entire farm away and laying down different layers of stratification like we see in the Grand Canyon. With the smaller horses in the lower levels of rock and the larger horses higher in the rock layers, which is what actually would happen, different sizes. And then imagine 1,000 years later, an archaeological dig takes place. How would an evolutionist be tempted to interpret the data? How would an evolutionist be tempted to interpret the data? Any thoughts? The little horses are lower in the strata. They evolved into the bigger horses. Yeah, good. How would a six-day creationist interpret the data? A scientist, a six-day creationist scientist, how would they interpret the data? What's that?
Different horses.
They were just different horses. Yeah. There's a mathematician. I'm trying to remember the quote. I didn't write it down. He says a pile of scientific facts. A pile of facts is as much a science as a pile of bricks is a house. Does that make sense? A pile of facts is as much a science as a pile of bricks is a house. Scientific data must be interpreted, and if you start with the evolutionary worldview, it will be pretty easy to interpret the data according to your worldview. And on the flip side, if you're a creationist, you also interpret the data according to your worldview. The trouble is that if the evolutionist believes in scientism, then he's got a whole host of other problems that we've covered in this. So, and here's a real world example of this. In 2005, Mary Schweitzer, the lead researcher at North Carolina State University, discovered soft red blood cells and blood vessels that were still elastic in a Tyrannosaurus rex leg bone. She made the discovery by accident. For a long time, this woman and the lab refused to perform C14 radiometric dating on the specimen because it's a dating method that is only meant to be used on anything under 45,000 years old. And they were like that would be irrelevant. This fossil is at least 70 million years old. So why would we do C14 dating on it? One organization even offered to pay for the C14 testing and make a $30,000 grant to the NC State Library if the tests would be done. The evolutionary scientists refused. So, and the end of the story is eventually they caved, and they did do the C14 dating. So this whole worldview issue slowed down rather than sped up the scientific process.
Is this the same story where they actually found preserved blood, and the reason why they didn't want to date it is because their theory that blood basically disintegrates after so many years, and this being a prehistoric animal disproves their theory on how old these animals work.
Well, yeah, and now
If this is the same story I'm thinking of, that was the real reason, that was the real crux of the story, that was the big deal, is they found preserved blood in that supposed prehistoric animal.
Oh yeah. I think it is the same story. If not, there are many stories that came after this, because this was the first one.
Yes.
So since then, scientists have been discovering soft tissue in dinosaur bones all over the world.
Yes.
And it has been, and these bones have been dated using the C14 dating method. This doesn't fit the old Earth narrative. So they're having to rewrite their books because of this. The results have been anywhere from under 10,000 to around 30,000 years old. You know, and there are questions about even the adequacy of C14 dating to get accurate dates. How many of you have heard of junk DNA? Yeah, you've heard of junk DNA. It's so, the theory that the evolutionists came up with is that junk DNA is kind of the leftover DNA that had no purpose, left over from the evolutionary process. So it was just the detritus, the junk that was left over after DNA figured out what it was going to do. And so they considered it junk DNA. They didn't do any tests on it. They didn't try to figure it out. Like, this is just worthless. This is just a worthless part of the DNA. Well, that has completely changed. Because scientists have realized that this junk DNA is very, very important to the development of biological life. And what they're discovering is that there is, so they came up with the theory of junk DNA not because of the evidence, but because of their worldview. Does that make sense? Not because of the evidence, but when they have finally decided to actually test the evidence, they realize that junk DNA is not junk, that it has a lot of value. Yeah.
And wasn't there a claim that the junk DNA was because it was decomposed DNA, like it wasn't a complete DNA? If I remember correctly?
I don't know that for sure.
I think that was it, but don't quote me on that.
Huh. So worldview affects scientific studies, scientific beliefs, and holding to certain theological and philosophical positions while you do science actually messes up the scientific method. You know. So anyhow, any other thoughts or questions? That's what I have for tonight. Yeah. Right.
Kind of an analogy to what you were saying. They were trying to, this is some years back, so they were trying to make a model of weather.
Make a what?
Of weather.
A model of weather, okay.
And to, check out tornadoes or weather events so they could predict it. So they drove the data into the computer, what have you. And they were noticing that, okay, there's all this data we can need. So they chunk it chuck the data, thinking that they didn't need it. So the weather, they couldn't produce an accurate weather model because it was very mechanical. Very mechanical. So this doesn't sound right, doesn't look right. So another scientist, if you will, said, wait a minute, what about all this data that you're getting rid of? So they began putting that data back into the weather model, and it started to act like actual weather. So they could begin to predict tornado events and weather events because all of the data we got was worthless. Somebody got the right idea, let's put it back in, and it started to act like real weather.
That sounds like the junk DNA idea, right? Yeah. Yeah, Jesse.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that worldview is inescapable.
Worldview is inescapable. Everyone has a worldview.
And I think it's worth noting that even these scientists that believe in scientism, they will stumble upon things that are true, right? They will find out true things, but I think it's important to note that why that is. That's because they're borrowing from the God that they're denying but knows exists. They can't help it. They're made in His image, and that's why they stumble upon truth from time to time.
Right. Oh yeah. And even in their use of logic and mathematical truths, they try to turn those against the Christian belief system. What they don't understand is logic and math flows from the mind of God. You know, it's completely independent of the natural world, logic and mathematical truths. And strange enough, they line up with, like we do math problems in our head, and then we turn to the real world, and the real world matches these math problems. You see numbers in the real world. You know, math can be completely cognitive apart from any scientific data. And so what they discover is that they are fighting against God using weapons that He has provided them. If that makes sense. Fighting God. It's like Cornelius Van Til, he says, these men are like a young boy a young child that's mad at his father and he wants to slap him in his face. But he realizes he has to climb up in his lap in order to get that done. Does that make sense? So anyhow, that's all I have for tonight. Let's pray. Lord, thank you that you have provided us with minds that can reason through these things, and logic and the reasoning ability truly comes from you, because you are a God who thinks this way. You are a God who reasons, who the laws of logic flow from your character. And morality flows from your character in the same way. Lord, you are the logos, the foundation of all reasoning and logic. And Lord, I pray that you would strengthen the intellectual faith, especially of our young people here, that as they go and they face these professors that will have spent a lot of time thinking through these things, a lot longer than they have. I pray, Lord, that you would strengthen their faith and that you would help them to gain answers to the issues that they will run into with people at work and people in class. I pray that no one would be twisted away from the faith because of these kinds of things. In Jesus' name, amen.